Now we're good to go. Welcome everyone to our forum on gender and public law. We are very happy to have with us today four wonderful speakers and look forward to the discussion that will follow. I'm Marcela Prieto Rudolphy. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law, and co-organizing with me is Michaela Hailbronner, also a professor, and Gráinne de Búrca, also professor at SPAM at NYU. Professor Gráinne de Búrca will also be taking your questions. So Gráinne, if you want to say anything about how you will go about collecting them.
So my plan is when the speakers have finished, that people can raise their hands, but you can also send me questions if you prefer in the chat box, and I will articulate them for the panelists at the end. But I would plan to do this as we might normally by raising the hand signal towards the end, and I can take them as they appear in turn. So whichever you prefer, chat or hand up. Welcome to everyone also on behalf of Michaela, Marcela and myself. I think some of you will have joined us on our earlier gendered impact of COVID Zoom, some of you just now. We're really grateful to those Anna, Chris, Ruth and Stefano for joining us for this, because they have contributed to a special issue, a mini special issue of our journal, and this is an opportunity for them to speak to some of the issues they wrote about. With that, I'll hand back to Marcela and look forward to taking your questions afterwards.
Thank you, Gráinne. So as I was saying, Michaela, Gráinne and I are all professors, but we are also part of the editorial team at the International Journal of Constitutional Law. And as such, we recently organized a special section about gender and public law. And we invited a number of scholars to share with us the reflections on gender and public law, particularly in the current circumstances in which we're seeing a rise in many parts of the world of phenomena such as misogyny, homophobia, racism, and a backlash against sexual minorities. And so as part of that special section, we have with us today four of our contributors who are going to speak on different issues about gender and public law. And so I will now move to introduce them. So we have with us Professor Christopher McCrudden, who's a professor of equality and human rights law at Queen's University Belfast, and also a professor of law at University of Michigan Law School, who will be talking about resurrecting public action. We also are delighted to welcome Professor Ruth Rubio Marin, who's also a full professor of constitutional law at Universidad de Sevilla, as well as Director of Gender and Governance Cluster at the School of Transnational Governance in the European University Institute, and the Director of UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Interculturalism at Universidad Internacional de Andalucía. And she will be discussing gendered nationalism and constitutionalism. We also have with us Professor Anna Śledzińska-Simon, who's Associate Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Wrocław. And she also collaborates with the Academy of European Law and the Polish Helsinki Foundation of Human Rights and other NGOs on human rights, education or litigation projects. And she will be talking about populist, gender, and national identity. And finally, we have with us Professor Stefano Osella, who's currently a research fellow in the Law and Anthropology Department of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. And he will be discussing the idea of degendering the civil status, which is, of course, a public law problem. I thank you again to our wonderful speakers for being with us today. Each of them will talk around 10 minutes about the topic of their choice. And of course, as Gráinne mentioned, we welcome each of the participants to please ask questions so that we can have then a lively Q&A part to this forum. And with that, I cede the floor to Professor Christopher McCrudden. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for being here. And it's wonderful to see so many old friends and I hope new friends. So I'd like to share my screen with you for a brief presentation. Can you now see it? It should be coming up now.
Yes.
So, so this is a deeply unfashionable talk. because it's not about any of the more recent kinds of issues. It's about an issue that was probably unfashionable in the 1980s, but the problem that I was confronted with was having to assess what is, as I said, a very old policy, but one that still remains quite central to European, at least purports to be central to European Union gender equality policy. So it was really a question of trying to assess an old policy that remains supposedly central on behalf of the Commission. So the Commission asked me to look at the actual application of this policy in the member states. So in order to do that, I was asked to cooperate with the Gender Equality Network. Now, the Gender Equality Network is, many of you will know, basically one or sometimes two individuals from all of the member states who specialize in anti-discrimination law. Usually one on gender equality issues and one on more broadly anti-discrimination or non-discrimination issues. So the way in which these reviews are conducted is essentially to send out a very detailed questionnaire to assess a particular policy and then report on it. So the question that I was asked to consider was whether or not the gender-based positive action program that the Commission and the European Parliament in particular are enthusiastic about actually works in the European Union and the EEA. And this is the report that was published. And it's the report that then I built on for the piece that I did for ICON. And thank you to ICON for inviting me to contribute to it. And much of this will not be surprising to you. So the notion of positive action, as I said, is a relatively well-known one. And I've put, for those of you who are interested, quite a formal definition of positive action. But it really echoes much of what this group will always have recognized to be positive action. So the assessment is the 27, now 27, then 28 member states. And it attempts to assess not only what's going on in the member states under member state law, but also whether there are particular problems that arising from EU law in implementing positive action, and to make recommendations to the Commission. So the key points in the talk are really quite simple, indeed embarrassingly simple. The first is that positive action, as I said, remains a supposedly key element in EU gender equality strategy. Second is that the current state of play as to what actually happens is depressingly familiar, which is that very little is happening in terms of positive action. And so the question obviously arises, why? And again, the answer is pretty simple. And this is where it gets into public law in particular, which is that the wrong strategy has been adopted by the EU in terms of how to achieve positive action in practice at the member state level. And the fourth point is that in order to address the problem, a new, more evidence-based EU strategy is needed, one that builds on what are good practices at the member state level. Needless to say, this is from the Commission and the Union's point of view, although depressingly simple, are really quite radical in terms of what they would need to do. So let's get into some of the detail, and I'm conscious that I've got a limited amount of time. So since the 1980s, it's been regarded as central. It's not obviously the only policy. There are many other policies that interlink with it, but it remains a key term in terms of most policy documents that come out. in this context, it's worth distinguishing and seeing how it links with the particularly anti-discrimination policy. And the report suggests a distinction between, which many of you will be familiar with, between discrimination and inequality. And again, rather simply, gender equality is mostly pursued through non-legal measures at the EU, whilst anti-discrimination goals are mostly grounded in legally enforceable obligations. So that has various implications for positive action. Essentially, positive action remains an exception in EU anti-discrimination law. It's obviously a policy preference that positive action takes place, but the way it's instantiated in the law is that it's an exception. And the exception fits into pretty squarely into a subsidiarity self-regulation approach. So the exception in EU law makes the adoption of positive action possible, but it doesn't require its adoption in the member states. Whether a member state buys into positive action and to what extent is in the hands of the member states themselves, essentially. There's very little downside to a member state not adopting positive action in its member state law. Within the member states, there's then a second, as it were, discretionary element introduced, which is that most member states adopt a policy of self-regulation in the area. Voluntarism, let's call it that, meaning that organizations set their own standards. So one of the potential advantages of subsidiarity and self-regulation is that member states and employers have the opportunity to experiment. And that's clearly a positive, potentially positive angle to subsidiarity and self-regulation. It's the classic justification for it. Unfortunately, there's very little experimentation actually takes place and extremely little learning from one state to the next. So in other words, the experimentation that might have taken place from which we can learn, I'm simplifying a 200-page report, but essentially doesn't happen. So the current state of play can be summed up in a series of assertions, really. There is evidence for each of these in the report, but basically the concept of positive action is not well understood in the states, the EU and the EEA. So the concept itself is regarded as ambiguous and uncertain. And therefore it varies considerably between states as to what is counted as positive action, ranging from quotas at the one end through to what some member states think of as positive action is what other states would regard as simple non-discrimination approaches. There's almost no monitoring of the effectiveness of these measures, let alone enforcement of the standards. The influence of the EU in securing understanding is widely seen as weak. It's either often misrepresented, misinterpreted, or ignored. Considerable divergence, therefore, as to what positive action is considered to be for, what its telos is, little learning between states as to what works and what doesn't, and the use of different terminology in the member states is a cause of considerable terminological confusion. This isn't just a language issue in terms of translation, but even those within similar language groups are using different terms. And when it does occur, it's sporadic, time limited, and of uncertain effectiveness. So surprise, surprise, none of this is unfamiliar. It would have been pretty clear to anybody who was reading reports from the 1980s in terms of monitoring this policy. So depressingly familiar, really. So why is it the wrong strategy? Well, the suggestion is that an unintended effect, clearly, of EU anti-discrimination law has been that it has a disincentive in terms of positive action policy. So flowing from the dominance of the anti-discrimination approach, which has been relatively successful in my view, a significant barrier to the adoption of positive action is the primary emphasis of the EU on process rather than results. And I'm characterizing controversially, I assume, the anti-discrimination approach is largely process driven. So the emphasis on process is particularly accentuated because of the relative lack of emphasis on tackling indirect discrimination. which might have given it, as it were, a more results-oriented approach. So even if it were correct that reducing discrimination would be enough in itself to ensure equality, which it isn't, that would be the case only if those norms were effectively enforced, which in many respects are not. So given the dominance of the anti-discrimination model, it's also not surprising that positive action itself is largely seen through an anti-discrimination lens. So it comes to be viewed simply as an exception to the anti-discrimination policy itself. So where the EU does see the need to go beyond the anti-discrimination principle, it's substantially restricted to the adoption of a highly voluntaristic approach to positive action led by the member states. The EU, acting under the constraints of the member states, considers essentially that positive action is an issue better left to the member states and is subsidiarity. And that is not just a description of the approach, it's also a problem. So the vagueness that surrounds the idea of positive action and the absence of specific guidance as to what effective positive action measures consist of is a real problem. The guidance that was issued in the 1980s, I found out, has not actually been reprinted and is very difficult to obtain. So significant degree of uncertainty as to what the ultimate goals are supposed to be, and a highly selective approach taken to the integration of international human rights thinking, particularly based on CEDAW. CEDAW takes a significantly different approach in some respects, but that has percolated into some member states, but relatively few, and not at the Commission or the EU parliamentary level. So what's an alternative? Again, embarrassingly simple, I think. First is clarify the objectives that positive action is intended to achieve. That is, if you want a positive action measure to be key in your strategy. Second, shift to a positive obligations approach. In other words, the negative obligations that arise from anti-discrimination law really do not begin to address what would be necessary to create a legally clear and enforceable positive action set of measures. Third, be specific in terms of what the measures are. And in that context, the wide range of measures that are currently used and available are very seldom taken up consistently right across the European Union. In other words, one country will adopt one measure, another a different one, but very few adopt the full range. Clarify the relationship between merit and gender preferences. That, despite the fact that we've been talking about this for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, the relationship between merit and gender preferences really is not clear in many member states. Encourage reflexivity, and here we come back to public law approaches, as it were, by giving employers a degree of flexibility as to how best to achieve the goals. So smart regulation, if you like. And that would involve targeting selected employers only and require the development of the appropriate regulatory institutions and practices. We could talk a bit more about that if anyone's interested. Importantly, absolute necessity of revisiting subsidiarity. Taking action within the existing acquis to the extent that we can. Certainly encouraging more buy-in to the new policy by the Court of Justice, which in its early days, of course, was problematic in terms of the approach that was taken. And finally, propose a new directive. And the proposal of a new directive is not simply, as it were, in order to produce a particular result. What we find is that in the context of the company board's policy, that a number of member states took very significant action because a new directive was being proposed, simply because of the directive being proposed. And so it becomes a stimulus in itself. So thank you. My apologies for the simplicity of all of this. As I say, it's a 200-page report. Will the Commission do anything with it? Let's wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that sobering report on the effects of positive action. Let's hope that the plan you set out is eventually adopted and we see some change. And with that, I would like to give way to Professor Ruth Rubio Marin and her thoughts on gendered nationalism and constitutionalism.
Okay. So hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would have preferred to be in Poland, especially I would have preferred the conditions that impede us from being there not to exist. But it's still nice to see you through the screen in the hope of seeing you soon in flesh. So basically, the starting premise for my contribution to the issue was the thought that feminist engagements with constitutionalism had so far focused on two things. One was predominantly the rights, and secondly, state structure. So a growing debate around women's representation, electoral system, quotas, but also gender assessment of federal arrangements. And I felt that the focus had been much less on the conception of nation that, however, we know underlies or is crafted by constitutions. And since ICANN was taking place in Poland and in the face of undeniable surge of nationalism in the region, as in the rest of the world, I'm afraid, and also in the light of the very clearly gendered undertones of this nationalism, I decided to tackle this agenda. Now, in exploring the specific ways in which nationalism is gendered, I followed the distinction that Yuval Davis uses when distinguishing on the one hand between first nationalist ideologies that focus on the definition of citizenship in specific states and territories. So that's the concept of the Staatnation. Those that place an emphasis, secondly, on specific cultures or religions. So this would be the Kulturnation. And those that are constructed around the specific origin of the people and its continuation into the future, so the Volknation. Now, we know that these ideologies often intersect with each other in real life, but also that different specific aspects of gender relations play an important in each of these dimensions or conceptions of nationalism. In the constitutional landscape, these three dimensions of nationalism often translate into a denial or severe limitation of women's rights and autonomy, as well as that of sexual minorities. Yet, because such limitations are presented as for the sake of the survival of the nation, I suspect that they can enjoy a degree of popular acceptance and even of judicial acceptance that the outright affirmation of women as non- or second-class citizens would not. So in the rest of my contribution, what I do is I explore these three different dimensions briefly, drawing from ongoing constitutional evolutions and struggles in different parts of the world today. So let me then devote a few moments to each of them. Gendered constitutionalism and the Staatnation. Now, of course, the notion of state citizenship was created around the idea that rights would in fact not be conferred upon individuals, but upon men as representatives of a family, and marriage being this consent-based institution that would legitimize women's subordinate position in the modern order. In this, modern constitutionalism just drew from the liberal and republican citizenship traditions upon which it was built, and there are patriarchal differentiation, as we all know, between the public and the private spheres, emphasizing the special and biologically determined role of women within the family. Now, it is worth noting that the idea that this construct, the separate and gendered construction of domains, contradicts core constitutional values is actually relatively contemporary and still a fragile conquest. Simply think of the contemporary discourse, also in the Western world, around complementarity and the ways in which actually it goes much beyond the biological affirmation of the sexual binary to encompass the normative endorsement of the gender roles. Now, in other regions of the world, of course, where autochthonous pre-existing notions of membership were similarly imbued with patriarchal elements, but where democratic constitutionalism as a whole was embraced much later, the struggle to affirm a notion of state citizenship that is entirely free from normative gender codes justifying sex-based discrimination is still very much ongoing. And I exemplify this in the paper by drawing on case law from the recent case law over the last 2005 case law from the South Korean Constitutional Court, striking down the traditional, I don't know how you pronounce it, Hojuje house, basically the household head system, whereby a household is comprised of a head of a household, always the eldest male in the family. So this kind of litigation is still ongoing as we speak. Secondly, gendered constitutionalism and the Kulturnation. Now, of course, this original household state, as we could call it, which was constitutionally entrenched in modern constitutionalism, has also had consequences for the crafting of the nation as a Kulturnation. If the national duties of men were to live and, if necessary, to die for the nation, women's roles were expected to be both the material, reproductive, and symbolic cultural recreation of the nation, a nation that women have often been simply taken to embody. Ask yourselves why so often the state is described as male and the nation as female. Now, this explains the central importance in nationalistic terms attributed to the rules that decide the coming into existence, the composition, the breakup of family units, such as rules deciding on the legitimacy of children, marriage, divorce, and widowhood. This also explains why these are precisely the regulatory domains that various cultural and religious groups typically want to retain and fight over in contexts of legal pluralism, where cultural, religious, customary, or tribal norms coexist with state norms. Now, the degree to which a constitutional system is willing to sacrifice gender equality values to accommodate discrimination and personal status law varies between constitutions. And there's a richness in the debate, which is exemplified in the paper by the insertion of exclusionary clauses, for instance, in post-colonial sub-Saharan constitutionalism, but also the rejection of these exclusionary clauses for the sake of making sex equality trump in contemporary constitutionalism, such as in Kenya and Zimbabwe's most recent constitutional reforms. But it is also portrayed, I claim, in the paper through a recent adoption of constitutional clauses that empower minority women in context of legal pluralism, where self-governance is recognized, for instance, to indigenous peoples in Ecuador and Mexico, but the importance of having women have a specific voice in that self-governing process is now constitutionally reflected. But I want to claim that even in contexts devoid of legal pluralism, this agenda is relevant. And it is relevant because we find contexts in which empowered majorities, not minorities, are pushing these agendas by calling on the allure of tradition, often in alliance with religious groups or movements in society, seeking nationalistic reaffirmations in a regional or in a global context. I think that this is what we are seeing, at least to some extent, in post-communist Eastern Europe and Western Asian countries. Now 8 countries have imposed, as a result of constitutional amendment, bans on same-sex marriage since 2006. And people have been heavily mobilized under the idea that serious threat to the very survival of the traditional and religiously imbued notion of the family as the foundational cell of the nation is what is really at stake. And then finally, gender constitutionalism and the Volksnation. So sometimes the dominant rhetoric to counter the globally expanding LGBTI agenda, as well as that of women's reproductive autonomy, is indeed directly linked to a concern about not only the cultural or the religious, but actually the physical, the demographic reproduction of the nation and its continuation in the future. In fact, what we see typically is a combination of ethnocultural and demographic concerns to form a narrative that is often charged with xenophobic undertones, suggesting that the issue is not limited to the aging of the population and its overall demographic sustainability, a concern that is widely spread, but also encompasses the idea of ensuring that the right stock is the one that breeds to avoid replacement, or in other words, to preserve the purity of the race. Now, rules on interracial marriage, rules on citizenship that privilege either the mother's or more commonly the father's ascendants, rules controlling birth rates, including those on contraception, sterilization, abortions, or infertility treatment, are among the traditional instruments of population control. They often, as we know, entail the denial or severe limitation of a domain of autonomy, reproductive autonomy, a domain that has traditionally been constitutionally neglected, maybe precisely because constitutions have tended to normalize women's prima facie motherhood duties and privilege the set of capabilities and primary goods that were deemed essential to human flourishing, understood as man's and not women's flourishing. In any event, because of the existentially threatening undertones of this specific subject matter, regression might be even possible in those constitutional democracies where women's reproductive autonomy has been constitutionally recognized for decades. This, I think, is exemplified by the real possibility that Roe versus Wade may be overturned in the United States, as a number of states and federal benches, emboldened by President Trump's rhetoric, are actively seeking to introduce laws designed to restrict abortion. At stake is the protection of America as a white and Christian civilization and the perceived fear that it will be replaced by immigrants. Similar fears have been voiced by Prime Minister Orbán in Hungary, where the constitution, as amended in 2011, recognizes the protection of fetal life from the moment of conception, and where restrictions on women's abortion rights are currently on the agenda. The Hungarian government has adopted policies under a procreation, not immigration banner that actively oppose immigration and refuse entry to refugees and subsidize traditional nuclear Hungarian families instead, who are encouraged to have more children. In sum, it seemed to me that the self-invitation that I did to myself to reflect upon the intersections between gender, constitutionalism, and nationalism deserved exploring these three different, though intersecting angles. And this is what I do in my contribution to the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This, of course, hits close to home for most of us, since in many countries, we're seeing this backlash against women and sexual minorities. And of course, the interesting relationship between these misogynistic and homophobic backlashes and ideas about the nation and what a pure people looks like. And I think this actually dovetails really nicely with our next speaker's topic, which is populist gender and national identity. So let me introduce Professor Anna Śledzińska-Simon. You are on mute.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation, both for the special issue, but I'm even more grateful for choosing Wrocław as the place of the conference, ICON's annual conference 2020, but I do really hope that the 2021 conference will take place. And I'm talking from the premises of the university, where I can just imagine that you are here in present. So thank you again for this privilege in both regards. My contribution, I realize it's more concerning a social life than a legal life, because I'm talking from a context where law has become particularly strongly instrumentalized for political reasons. So I moved my focus to the social reality, and I would like to present a few comments on what we find here, but also in relation to other countries where the gender backlash or the anti-gender activities are particularly significant. So I start with acknowledgement of the fact that populists are still very popular, and even populists such as the Law and Justice Party in Poland or Fidesz in Hungary, autocratic populists are popular. So the question is whether the success of the populist party is due to illiberal views in the society, or this is because of other reasons, reasons that are related perhaps to the crisis, or reasons related to propaganda, or perhaps Russian intervention, or this is a complex of reasons that explain. My one answer is that among these reasons is the fact that populists, especially right-wing populists in Poland, do adequately address existing social problems. And this is explaining why populists are still on the rise and are still winning, even in this autocratic way, dismantling all the guarantees of the rule of law. On top of that, they are very skilled in using psychological tools to mobilize emotions. So definitely this longing for belonging in the terms of also national identity, the fear or longing for security and order has played or have played a significant role why populists win. So when we look at presidential elections in America, there was the result of them made it evident that there is a 53% problem, because 53% of white women voted for Trump, while this was 93 non-white women who supported Hillary Clinton. So this was definitely related to the white feminism problem in America that does not exist in countries which are more homogeneous in terms of color and ethnic or racial origin. But definitely the problem with white feminism in America was that it did not recognize issues related to underprivileged women or poverty as such. So it also shows the difference in the current situation between America, where the populism is as we still see, in the rise, and Poland, where in the recent presidential elections, women voted in majority for the current president, so the incumbent President Duda. So shall we see this as a betrayal of women? Betrayal, given the fact that there is a very intense anti-gender, not only rhetoric, but actually anti-gender policies taking place and being introduced, sometimes blatantly. So that the laws that do restrict, or proposals for laws that do restrict abortion rights, or somehow tacitly under recent anti-COVID measures, laws that in particular allow doctors to refuse information about places where women could seek legal abortion. So shrinking rights for women, but also the rhetoric and policies targeting LGBT communities. So LGBTI, but basically this all falls into the general anti-gender backlash or cultural war, we could say. So when we see, or when I try to answer why women in Poland in majority supported the current president, so when we look at the exact results of the elections, there were over 50% of women supporting current President Duda, and 49% supporting his opponent. Duda was more popular among men, and Trzaskowski was more popular among women. And who were the women who were supporting the current president? They were mostly elderly women. There were mostly women living in the eastern of Poland. There were mostly women who were living in rural areas from the underprivileged, you could say, class. So it already shows that there is a particular take of these women, not only on the values represented by the populists in Poland, but on the program. So unlike in America, where social redistribution does not take place in the same form that we experience it in Europe, the populists in Poland did introduce a very, you could say, comprehensive program of addressing poverty, addressing family issues through wealth redistribution or family benefits redistributed for families with children. So this is all happening, and this is a very attractive, and this will still remain attractive, while also at the same time, the opponents or the opponents of the current populist, they are voting for values, and they strongly identify with Western, with European, pluralist, tolerant societies. And this division, because we talk about not only strong polarization that takes place in the political life, but very strong division that affects all lives of social reality. So we talk about academics not talking to each other because they belong to two different, you could say, tribes or groups. And it goes through all the levels, up to the families that do not talk to each other because they do support different values, but also they stand for a different program that stands, that is represented by the democratic opposition, and then on the other hand, by the populists. So this all happens while gender and LGBT still remain as a foreign term or a foreign phenomenon, because both gender and LGBT are foreign words. So at the level of semantics, they are not translated or they are not understandable for common people, you could say. So it was very easy for populists to mobilize and to use these terms, call it ideology, and create a sense that this is an invasion, this is a foreign enemy that we have to fight with. And similar tendencies or trends or similar mobilization can be observed in Brazil or in other countries, even in Brazil, but in Central Europe, Estonia, Croatia, where Brazil looks at gender ideology as neo-colonialism. Other places in Central, in Eastern Europe, it's either reflection of neo-Marxism or simply Western imposition, where this division reflects somehow an old rivalry between Russia and the Western world. So we face a very deep division in the society at all levels. And when I look for remedies, because I still see that perhaps the situation can be remedied, because the recent elections also show not only the unprecedented mobilization that is anti-democratic in social media, in public media, in all forms of campaigning, also by the government for the current president. There is also an unprecedented level of pro-democratic campaigning and mobilization. So there is this two parallel realities that do not meet. And that is a particular problem for interpretation of norms that are either in place, and I'm talking also about human rights norms that have been very fiercely, that have been fought for many centuries, you could say. But now there is a moment where the government limits the opportunities for women and for minorities, sexual minorities, but also religious minorities, to enforce and claim their rights. So it's also at the level of access to court and enforcing their rights in courts, not to mention the entire problem of rule of law backsliding. So I would imagine that national identity finally stops or is not using anymore the old notions of tradition, family, and religion, but is transferred into something that can really unite, and reflect social identity, because social identity and social norms, they are changing, and we can see, again, unprecedented level of support both for gay marriages or gay partnerships, but also tolerance. Again, there is a split. The western part of Poland is more tolerant and the eastern part of Poland is less tolerant, or people will not speak openly about their preferences because of the majoritarian sort of pressure. And I believe that, again, there is 1/3 of Polish citizens or entitled voters who did not take part in elections. So there are the potential to move in one way or another, the majority that rules. But at the current state of art, we are a divided nation, a nation that stopped talking to itself, so to say, and there is little remedies that can effectively help from both European law and international law, because either we are moving within the limits of the margin of appreciation where the state is allowed to take certain measures, or these are simply permitted actions, as the action to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention that has been recently announced as the program of the government. So this is where we stand, and I'm just simply throwing this couple of comments and asking for a debate or a discussion. What can be done? How can we unite and again talk to each other for finding a way to create a community that is based on a consensus that can be a basis for legitimacy of government and its policies, and not the rule of the majority that became tyrannical and became strongly exclusionist towards minorities and all type of others that, even though formally they belong to the Polish nation, they do not belong in public debates because they are called traitors or enemies. And I'm sure that this type of debates are relevant for Israel, for United States, for Brazil. And this is a global problem, though from my perspective, something that perhaps has to do also with our communist legacy or our particular position on the world map. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And with Anna's final call to perhaps the audience to also chip in and give us their thoughts and questions on these issues. And once again, Anna was highlighting the connection between what is considered as foreign, such as gender and LGBTQI, and which also, of course, dovetails nicely with what Ruth was saying about the connection between nationalism and gendered views of the world. And speaking about gender, I will now give the floor to Professor Stefano Osella, who will be talking precisely about degendering the civil status.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you very much, Marcela. Thank you everyone else for being here, and it's a real honor to be invited to speak with you and to contribute to the special issue of the Icon Journal. So, really thank you. I think that my speech is conveniently at the end of this session, because what I believe is that all of these interventions that preceded me have in common is the idea that in the law we have gender categories, which are usually recorded and contained in the civil status. Now, I believe this fact that we take as granted, is becoming less obvious as a consequence of a series of decisions that have been given by constitutional courts. And so what I'm going to do now is basically ask myself, it's really kind of an open question, I don't have an answer myself, but it's really to ask whether a genderless civil status can be constitutionally permissible, especially in consideration of the risks that a genderless civil status may have for creating a gender-blind law. This question arises from the decisions of a few European constitutional courts, precisely the German, the Austrian, and the Belgian constitutional courts, which essentially suggested that the presence of the civil status in the law is a matter for the legislator, and it is a matter for towards which the constitution is essentially not neutral. And to me, this question is puzzling, because what I'm asking myself is this really is it really so? Is it true that gender presence in the civil status is constitutional neutral? And to this question, I will try to problematize this question a little in the following of the talk. The context out of which this question is generated has to do with the litigation that has been brought forward by trans activists and advocates for the recognition precisely for gender recognition. Just as a quick reminder, trans identity is this gender identity, that sense of gender, deep-seated sense of gender self, which does not correspond to gender assignment at birth. Trans people identify, so to say, with another gender or the other gender if within the binary. There is a plurality of trans identity. There is no one specific trans identity. There is not the trans identity. And what however these many different trans identities have in common is the demand for gender recognition. Gender recognition is, for the purpose of this presentation, but usually it is so defined in the literature, is the correction of one civil status, one legal status in birth registries, civil registries, and documents, etc. Why trans advocates are asking for gender recognition? Usually because of the great benefits that this brings to trans people from the psychological, but also social and economic point of view. A central demand of trans people as of recently has been gender self-determination, meaning the right to determine one's own legal gender in the law without requirements, preconditions, or validations. So just the right to declare one's own gender identity and being so recorded by the law. It is a trend that is now taking hold in comparative law. There are several jurisdictions which are adopting this approach to gender recognition, but still it is more of an exception than a rule. And along with gender recognition, we are witnessing the demand for the additional of further gender categories, so the so-called third gender, or as it has been called in German, the third option. And it is precisely against this background, and more precisely against the background of additional gender categories to the civil status, that the three courts that I mentioned before, so the German, the Austrian, and the Belgian court, have enunciated the possibility of a genderless civil status. So in three decisions which have been given by this court, what basically the court said was that individuals have the right to be registered according to their gender identity, which can be binary or non-binary. Alternatively, what the legislature can do is just to remove gender from the civil status. So having people not categorized according to their gender, and this, of course, accommodates everybody in a way. And this suggestion, which is a suggestion of constitutional neutrality, for me is puzzling, because I believe that removing gender classification from the civil status may, in fact, affect other constitutional principles. We know that gender and gender classifications are widely relied on categories for the organization of the legal and social life. A plurality of legitimate objectives rely on gender categorization. And, you know, so removing gender from them can be, gender as a criterion for classification is particularly problematic, especially when it comes, I believe, to the area of gender equality, which, by the way, has been widely debated among scholars. So the idea that, you know, a genderless civil status can be a problem for gender equality. And of course, even though a genderless civil status is not the same as a genderless law, still the question as to how we can have a gender conscious law without having people registered according to their gender is, I think, a valid question that desperately needs to be addressed, you know, before embracing a genderless civil status. This is particularly the case, of course, in gender equality law. Indeed, while we can think of discrimination law without a general categorization according to gender, for instance, you know, we can think of discrimination based on religion. I believe that, you know, many jurisdictions don't have categorization according to the religion, but still they manage to protect individuals from being discriminated against on religious grounds. I'm not sure that the same can be said when it comes to more general action, affirmative actions relating to equality and more specifically to gender equality. So what I'm here to ask is gender categorization necessary in order to achieve measures such as quotas, welfare programs, or substantive, in general, you know, positive actions for gender equality in the various fields, from politics to employment? Are there any other ways to achieve these measures, if not general categorizations of individuals according to their gender? I don't have an answer myself. My sense is that no, that some kind of registration is needed, but still this is an empirical question which I don't really want to answer myself. You know, it is possible, and you know, I'm really looking forward to it if someone says, you know, there are other ways other than general categorization in order to you know, to achieve this objective. But it's a question that I leave open. But I believe that, you know, this aspect ought to be investigated, and this is very much not what I say in the paper that is coming out with the special issue of ICON. And if the answer to this question is in the negative, so whether we don't have other means besides categorization to achieve gender equality, specifically through substantive equality measures, then my question is, gender status cannot be, the presence of gender in the civil status is no longer constitutionally neutral, but requires, but you know, it's somehow constitutionally mandated. I want to emphasize, specifically because this matter has been born out of trans litigation, that a gendered civil status is not necessarily at odds with trans demands. In fact, we noticed that several advocacy statements and demands of trans people, the demand is not to remove gender from the civil status altogether, and there is in fact the acceptance of the presence of gender in the civil status as long as it is necessary to pursue legitimate objectives. In the Yogyakarta principle, the widely relied on and the widely famous advocacy statement on LGBTI rights, gender categorization is not rejected to cure, but is rejected as long as not pursuing a legitimate objective. A trans theorist such as Todd Davis, who advocated and argued in favor of a genderless civil status, even folk Davies acknowledged that in some cases, for instance, gender equality, the presence of categories may be necessary and important. This, of course, doesn't entail that gender categories are not should not be able to welcome trans rights. We have to rethink gender categories in order to welcome the position of people who are not corresponding to the traditional understanding of gender. So this means that gender categories ought to be compatible with the principle of gender self-determination and perhaps contain a plurality of options. Actually, no perhaps, for sure containing a plurality of options besides the established gender binary, as well as the option to be legally genderless if one wishes to do so. So what we see now at play, and I think this is going to be a central aspect in the future discussion of gender in the law and as a matter of public law, is the presence of gender categories, which are, however, profoundly changed and transformed from the previous understanding of gender categories. So we don't see now gender categories bringing forward and keeping the idea that there is a permanent binary and immediately intelligible sexual binary. This idea is fading away. So we are having new gender categories based on gender self-determination, on a plurality of gender and so, but still present. Still present precisely in order to avoid to throw away the baby with the bathwater. And so to preserve gender equality or to keep preserving gender equality while at the same time protecting trans rights. Of course, and I am about to conclude, this new understanding of gender categories, so a gender category without a gendered subject, is liable to some, to some shortcomings, it can be criticized. So the question becomes, who is entitled to be classified in one way or another? So especially when this can be especially problematic when it comes to for instance, to affirmative actions. Who is entitled to the benefits given to a certain affirmative action? So in a way, we are going to have troubles in understanding, issues such as identity fraud, such as inappropriate claiming of benefits and so on. But I think that overall we can figure out this problem in the future. But this, however, entails, and the discussion today confirmed to me, that we still very much need gender in the law and in the civil statute. There are risks, there are political choices to be made, but I think that gender is to be preserved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and thanks to all the panelists for really interesting and thought-provoking contributions. And I think Stefano's and Chris's contributions are nicely in conversation with each other. As Stefano's saying, the categories of gender make sense of positive action measures. And if we're to move away from gender categories, what else would replace those ways of achieving justice, socio-cultural justice in particular context. So really interesting, thoughtful presentations there. And similarly, Ruth's and Anna's presentations speak very closely to one another in terms of the relationship between nationalism, populist nationalism and gender in many parts of the world at present. I'm going to ask those who are participating to raise your hand, use the hand raise function if you have a question you'd like to ask, and I will begin to take those questions. But while I'm waiting for people to begin, just a couple of reflections, maybe possibly one question to Chris. The first reflection that Anna's presentation stimulated as I was listening was that, what you're describing and what Ruth is describing is certainly happening in many parts of the world, deeply divided societies with somehow the nationalist versus cosmopolitan, liberal versus conservative, order versus progressivism, and so on. It's a very familiar picture, but somehow it's also rather different in many parts of the world. So these divisions are there, and they do reflect similar types of binaries or types of cleavage, let's say, in society, but at the same time, there are differences. And as you mentioned, the populist right in Poland, in Hungary, and elsewhere, also is accompanied by a distributive political agenda, and that has been a big part of its popularity and success. Not so in the United States, where the populist right-wing agenda is not accompanied by a distributive agenda. There, the distributive agenda is on the liberal or progressive side. I also was struck as you spoke by being from Ireland myself, and Poland and Ireland are often put as sort of very similar states with the Catholic Church's strong position and other kinds of socio-cultural similarities. And yet, in Ireland in recent decades, we've had a move against, anti-gender ideology towards a more progressive reproductive rights on the one hand, LGBTQ equality recognition on the other hand. And I think one of the differences is obviously time. So Ireland's period of a very strong church was some decades ago, and there have been so many scandals affecting the church since then that has also strengthened, I think, the movement for liberal protection of reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights, and less fear of and less influence of the church in that respect. But also, as you say, the distinctive issue of Russia in Central and Eastern Europe. So Russia is really leading the anti-LGBTQ ideology, as it's called, anti-gender ideology movement very effectively, and it's a coming together, I think, of the Russian Orthodox Church and sort of an authoritarian nationalist political move. And those two have come together very effectively in Russia, and that has, I think, influenced Poland, Hungary, and many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as other parts of the world. So I'd really welcome, hearing responses from Ruth, from Anna, and others as to those differences, and what explains the fact that in some parts of the world there's a more effective counter mobilization against the anti-gender ideology movement, and in others the movement is still on the rise, as we see, and law being used to entrench it. In Russia, the countries refusing to ratify the Violence Against Women Convention, or revoking gender violence laws, as in Russia, and so on. The one question I have, I still don't see any. I have a hand up. That's good. I see a hand up, and I encourage others to do so. But my last question, which I'll put to Chris, and I won't ask any of you to answer until I take at least one question from the audience. The question to Chris is just my curiosity about the kind of decline of affirmative action in the EU, or at least the failure to get off the ground as a policy in the EU, despite the ostensible commitment of the EU to this. I remember in the early years when you mentioned that the court was first very much against affirmative action, saw it as an encroachment on equality, on gender equality, but then changed its mind under pressure from states which had extensive affirmative action policies, Scandinavian states, Germany, and so on. And I'm wondering what happened to those states. So you say, oh, well, there's no experimentation. I can see that there's no EU monitoring, there's no EU encouragement, there's no EU direction. But why isn't it bubbling up a little bit more, as it seemed to be in those initial years when the pushback against the Kalanka judgment came from various states? So I'm curious as to why there hasn't been any, even if subsidiarity is a bit too weak, as you point out, why haven't states presented more their successes? Is affirmative action failing at the domestic level as well, or is it really just a matter of non-monitoring, not following it up at the EU level? So before I go to the panelists for their responses, I'm going to take a question from Pamela Katz, who's, if you could unmute yourself, Pamela.
Yes, hi, thank you. I have a question for Stefano. In Germany, Austria, and Belgium, you mentioned there was some policy making regarding genderless civil status. Was that a court case or legislative? What was that?
Okay, and I'm going to take one more, if the panelists can handle it, from Matthias Moschel, and then I'll turn, because that's 3 or 4 questions, I'll turn back to the panelists. So Matthias.
Yes, hi everyone. So thanks a lot. And I'm not going to ask. I have questions for everyone. Not going to ask them to Anna and Ruth. We've been in touch on various occasions. So one question for me was for Chris as well. Does it have any or what role in the analysis that you made, the recent decisions by the European Committee of Social Rights that just came out, what is it, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, this sort of class action by University Women of Europe, where to some extent a number of these 14 countries that have the collective complaint procedure were found in minor or no violation to a full violation of the Charter of Social Rights. So I was wondering whether that comes in anyhow, because I thought it was quite an interesting, at least the proceeding in and of itself. And for Stefano, very short, or the whole discussion on the degendering, as you've seen, I'm wondering whether it really has to be this sort of either or kind of solution, or we've seen now the US Supreme Court including sort of transgender under sex discrimination for the Civil Rights Act. I mean, the EU has done this, the Court of Justice has done this years before, and now there's been discussions, well, why might it not just be that we say that really, if we take the word gender seriously, that men who are not performing in a certain way, in a certain gendered way, as expected, that would be simply the inclusion in whatever it is, whether then constitutionally or so whether really the actual existence of the categories really poses such a huge issue, or whether it might just not be a broader reading of, you know, what would be gender, and therefore any kind of form of discrimination might not be included there. So I'm wondering whether it is as sort of black and white in a certain way, and whether really the degendering really needs to a breaking up of the categorizations and of the protections offered under gender equality framework. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Matthias. I don't see any other hands up for the moment. So let me go back to the panel in order of the order in which people spoke, and start with Chris. Chris, would you like to address any of those questions?
Sure, all of them actually, but I won't. So just coming to your point, Gráinne, I think my point is essentially that let me clarify. My point is not that affirmative action or positive action, whatever you want to call it, isn't happening in different member states. It's that it's not being driven by EU approaches. In other words, that sometimes it happens in spite of EU law. Sometimes it happens just in complete distance from EU law or from EU approaches. So it's more the failure of the EU to drive the positive action agenda, rather than that it isn't happening in different member states, as it were, irrespective of EU approaches. But just picking up your Kalanka point, one of the intriguing elements in the national responses, by the way, I should thank all of the members of the network who have contributed to this. I'm merely a sort of spokesperson, as it were, of the network in this context. But one of the intriguing elements is that the Kalanka case seems to have a half-life. So however much, as it were, EU lawyers say, well, of course, Kalanka has been changed, it's remarkable how many member states' responses still mention Kalanka. And so, you know, this is quite important in terms of one of the points that I was making about getting the Court of Justice on board, because if they make a wrong step, as it were, what I would at least consider a wrong step, initially, that tends to have a continuing adverse effect. Partly it's bad faith that those who oppose positive action are using, as it were, the memory, the dim memory of Kalanka as a reason for resisting. So that's my first point, if I may. In terms of the response to Matthias, as it were, who asked the issue with regard to two elements, as it were, I'll just mention very briefly, if I may, before Stefano responds on the trans question and the meaning of gender. There is actually a section in the report specifically on the relationship between trans issues and positive action. And basically what we found was there is almost no thinking going on at member states on this question of the relationship between positive action or affirmative action and trans questions. So one of the problems is, I think, the lack of debate on the question, and therefore the difficulty in responding to Matthias's point about there are various possibilities, of course, that we might conceptualize, but there doesn't seem to me to be any debate going on about that. On your specific question to me, where I think it links into what I was saying was that the class action, if you like to call it, and particularly legal enforcement in the EU context would depend upon the shift to a much more positive obligations approach rather than a negative anti-discrimination approach. And, the Committee on Social Rights might engender that. We'll see. But certainly in the EU context, there is a very significant gap between the positive action approach and the anti-discrimination approach, which so far at least has not yet been bridged. And part of the argument of the report is that it should be.
I'm going to do something improper, Chris, because I wanted to ask one additional question before we move on to Ruth and her response to the questions. I wondered if the fact that you were commissioned to write this report is an indication of some renewed commitment to positive action, or is that too optimistic an assessment?
No, it's an interesting question. I don't think it was accidental that the report was commissioned prior to the coming in of the new commission, and the anticipation that a gender policy equality, particularly perhaps with the new president, would be on the cards. So it may be that it was, I can't speak for the commission officials, obviously, but it may be that they were doing exactly what a good civil servant would, which is to anticipate certain questions that would be asked and to try to get genned up on those. I'm not sure necessarily it does indicate a particular policy shift, but I think it does indicate a shift, as it were, of the tectonic plates within the commission itself as to personnel and potential issues that will arise.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. So let's move on. Ruth, would you like to respond to any of the questions or issues raised either by the other panelists or by the questions asked so far?
Yes, thank you, Gráinne. So maybe I will engage briefly with Chris because I would have expected a less bleak or pessimistic picture, partly because, as you know, I've been working on the spread of quotas across Europe, which I think is a revolutionary achievement in terms of conceptions of equality and democracy, both. Something for which the century will certainly be remembered. And although, of course, the European institutions, both in the framework of the Council of Europe and the EU, have limited competences in the field, I can definitely see that the soft law, the many endorsements, the many declarations, but also the funding, to programmatic actions that then feeds into civil society groups and the gender machinery that states have has produced amazing synergies and has definitely contributed to this achievement. So I guess everything depends on what you call positive action, but if you include, and I would imagine that quotas, not just in the political sphere, but as you know, growing in other domains of corporate governance, administrative bodies, universities, unions, political parties. I mean, it's a spread, and I think that from my understanding of it, the EU and the Council of Europe has been very instrumental in this struggle. So I think that at least some merit deserves to be given. I agree with you that for the rest, the blurry domain between the enforceable right to anti-discrimination and the normative programmatic aspiration of substantive equality, blah blah blah, is what creates this battle. But anyway, that was just an addition to that. And then maybe following on your invitation, and of course I'm not no one to say, Gráinne, because you are Irish and I'm not, but I do wonder whether the fact that whether in the Irish case, what we've actually seen is a constitutional moment of redefining the constitutional identity. So in a way, very much engaging with a certain understanding of Catholic nationalism, but kind of secularizing it, linked to the very interesting participatory process of, the Citizens' Assembly, the involvement. So I take your points, but I think that the fact that the country went through this exercise of actually having this very innovative, inclusive, participatory process allowed this to have this kind of redefinition of national and constitutional identity dimension. And for the rest, I think, yes, we're seeing backlash, but on the other hand, backlash is a reaction to things that are being achieved. It means that we are touching power. That's how I read it. It means that parity is working. It means that, suddenly you do see more and more women in power and more policies being put into place. And of course, how could we expect that such a revolutionary change? I mean, some of these countries, think of France, they had 12% of female representation before they started to redefine their notion of universalism, and now have, are now in the 40s. So this is a huge change that I think we could not expect to go without backlash. So in a way, it's a sign of success, and I'm sure that the battle of women's empowerment is not going anywhere, and we're going to see different countries hit different moments and different constellations that deal with the general challenges and the specific historical backgrounds, as Anna was saying. But I, not that I celebrate backlash, I don't, but I think it would have been naive to see these really huge changes taking place without resistance.
Thanks, Ruth. It's a very good point to note. I think it's good for all of us listening as well to remember that backlash, rather than it's always a cause of great challenge and depression in a way when you see this movement, but at the same time, it's a sign of the success of some of the moves towards gender equality preceding the backlash. And of course, human rights are always a struggle. And by definition, a struggle that doesn't end. So the challenge is to push back and to recognize the backlash as an invitation to further mobilization. And also it's nice to remember that the progress that's been made, as you point out. I'm going to move on to see if Anna and Stefano want to respond, but because we've only 5 minutes left, I'm going to read out the one other question that's come in case either of the two commentators remaining or anyone else wants to respond to them. So a participant from Chile talks about the difficulty for women who have been sexually abused or in cases of rape in bringing their rapists to justice, or not that they should, but in the state in bringing rapists to justice, and whether it would be possible to see a kind of a positive action reform of criminal law that makes criminal law in various parts of the world less onerous and less placing fewer obstacles in the way of victims when it comes to prosecuting rape trials. There's been a particularly horrific case recently in Chile. So let me move on to Anna and see whether Anna wants to address any of the general comments or specific questions that have come up.
Thank you very much for your invitation to comment. Well, the comparison between Ireland and Poland is perhaps as fascinating as comparison between Poland and Hungary. And I have to say, both differences and similarities appear as something that we can, again, draw this comparison. I do think that, well, this is my intuition, that there is no scandal whatsoever that is able to diminish the authority of the Catholic Church in Poland. So no pedophile scandal, especially now presented by the media that are taken over by the populists. It will be presented in the way that nobody will believe it. So there is no way the Catholic Church will diminish significantly is authority. So I think that no secular movement in Poland has a chance of a real success. This is my intuition, this is my personal take, and perhaps I could, but for the sake of this discussion, this is a point of departure. So here the similarity of, and I think your comment, Ruth, about participatory moment that was real explains why people in eastern of Poland, in these rural places where basically, you know, 400 euros salary is the maximum that they can achieve, you know, going to church is going to a civilization that they want to belong to. So this is something real that they, you know, it's a bit like, you know, when you say backlash and then, you know, this is the reaction, I just move back to the time when the Reformed Church, so the Contre-Reformation and Reformation took place. It's like, you know, you participate in something real, whereas when we look at the time when the liberals were in power in Poland, they have not particularly contributed much to the women's rights or LGBT rights. So I think that in the sense of, you know, identity, belonging, who do you support? You support something that's real in this world that became so much like virtual and digital. You want something tangible. So I think the participatory moment is important when there are local initiatives that give people the sense of community, belonging, and real action. But again, there are very much ad hoc initiatives that do not translate into something more permanent. I think I stop here because, Ruth, I would like to finish on this positive note that we celebrate the success rather than talk about, you know, a current that is rather diminishing rights than being a success. But I do agree that we have certain things to celebrate. Again, we face a moment where there are no remedies, even, you know, even the regime of EU rule of law and funding that definitely also streamed money to this policies that again are shared among the people, the families. So the money come indirectly from European Union funds. Definitely there is much to hope for in terms of moments of mobilization, but in the long term, due to the capture of media and propaganda, there might be time that there will be simply no hope. Again, I don't want to be negative, but I see it at this moment, rather in black light. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And not surprising, you feel a bit depressed after that very narrow election in Poland. However, the very narrowness of it again, and the fact that there was so much support, unexpected support for the opposition candidate, is reason to hope for the future. We have just a few minutes left, so let me turn to Stefano to see whether he would like to respond to any of the questions put. Stefano.
Yes, thank you so much, Gráinne. Yeah, I will be super quick because we don't have much time left. So to the question raised by Pamela, this suggestion of constitutional neutrality of the gender categories has come from the constitutional courts, respectively, of Germany, Austria, and Belgium, in cases where people were applying for a third gender recognition. So in these cases, the court said either the legislator grants a third gender via law or removes gender altogether from the civil status. But the bottom line is, as long as gender is recognized in the law, as long as gender is recorded in the civil status, then individuals must be able to identify with their own gender, which can be binary or not. And in so doing, they expressed, I think, a sort of a constitutional neutrality towards gender categories, because, you know, they said, you know, if you want to remove them, fine, to simplify it bluntly. Going to Matthias, and I will be super, super short. I mean, it's not an either or position, but my question is really, how can we think of affirmative actions, for instance, quotas in employment and so on and so forth, if people are not categorized in one way or another? We can say, you know, who is going to, if we are saying we reserve 40% of seats to women for that particular position in parliament or so, how can we say that these positions, how can we know that this number of positions is going to women if there are no people classified as such? And it is a different question from who is eligible to be classified as a woman. I myself am a strong advocate for gender self-determination, so I wouldn't, have controls on gender identity, but still, some kind of categorization is required. And even the question that you raised with regard to anti-discrimination, this was in reference of the recent decision of the Supreme Court of the US and to the European Court of Justice, on which I'm writing lately. The point is that these cases were anti-discrimination cases. So were single cases of people who had been discriminated against for being trans. So this was the case for the European Court of Justice. And in these cases, those people were fired or could not enjoy a benefit or so because they were not classified as women or because they were transitioning. These cases are single cases. So it's much easier to deal with these cases if they are in the singular. We don't have really, in many countries, there are no, I was making the examples before, there are no classifications based on religion. But still, if I'm discriminated against because of my religious conviction or lack thereof, I can go before a judge and ask for redress because this is like, a single case. But the problem comes, I think, when we have like mass or measures to administer. And so I'm not saying that being classified like a general classification is the only answer, but I'm saying that before saying that gender classification can be removed from the civil status, this question ought to be addressed. That's as far as I go. But thank you for the question.
Right. I'm afraid we are out of time, but before we finish, I want to thank, first of all of our panelists for their excellent, concise, but really packed and informative contributions. I want to encourage all of you on the call, though, participants, to read the upcoming issue of ICON, because we have not just these 4 contributions, but a number of others, and I think they're all really worth reading. I also want to thank Marcela and Michaela for co-organizing this, and Fred and the ICONS team who are managing the Zoom call and the previous webinar for helping us to set it up. It's been great to see all of you. I wish too we were in Wrocław. I hope we will be this time next year and that we can continue these conversations, and particularly to think now and in the meantime on the many dimensions of gender and public law. So thanks to all of you, particularly to our panelists, and we will see each other again soon on Zoom and hopefully in person next year.